Welcome back to BLOCKTV. It's time for Crypto Globe, where we take a trip around the world to hear about the latest developments in the industry. And to guide us on this tour, of course, is our tour guide, Ethan Pierce, director of the Paris-based CryptoAssets Institute. Ethan, thanks for joining us today.
Always good to be here, Yona.
All right, well, we have to jump off with the big story. JPMorgan, the largest bank in the US, there's rumors that they might merge their blockchain unit with Consensus. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I think, at this point, it's just a proposed idea, but so Quorum is their in-house blockchain at JPMorgan, and it's based on Ethereum. It's what they're using for this. They have the Interbank Information Network, which is a group of around 360 banks trading global payments data over the blockchain, and then it's also will potentially be the base for the JPM coin if they release that. So it kind of makes sense. Already there's the Ethereum kind of connection there. And I guess for a while now, they've been looking at whether or not they would want to spin this out as either a startup or a nonprofit foundation, or potentially do a merger. And according to this story, the merger idea seems to be the most likely outcome. I think it's pretty cool. It continues the trend that we're going to see. I think the decentralized fan club is never going to like most of these ideas, but the reality is for a lot of this stuff to scale to first scale, in terms of financial services, we're going to see a lot of partnerships between the historical financial industry and projects in the blockchain and crypto space. So it's not going to be all or nothing in terms of decentralized. So I think this is a sign of continued connections between the corporate world and the blockchain and crypto world. So I guess we'll see where this goes. It's just fun to see the shift with people like JPMorgan having nothing to do or even being terribly anti-crypto, at least in words, and then diving in pretty much with both feet. So
exactly. And you're referring to the JPMorgan head, Jamie Dimon, who notoriously was very anti-Bitcoin, very anti-crypto. But I think this brings us back to the age-old argument of blockchain versus crypto, seemingly a big win for blockchain. Do you think this will lead to more positive takes from JPMorgan on cryptocurrency as well? There are talks of them releasing their JP coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is most of these organizations are saying one thing, but potentially doing something else, or at least planning to do something else, because they realize that in some form or another, the future is digital. And so when it comes to digital currencies and transforming the financial system through tokenization, I think that all of these companies realize that is something that's going to be there, whether or not they're willing to admit that publicly. But you have like last year, you have the quote from Dimon where he's basically saying this is terrible, this is not interesting, blah blah blah. And the next week, Circle, which was part of their group, buys Poloniex. So, I think he was aware that was happening. So I think a lot of these kind of conversations are they have to say one thing in public and do another thing, but we're starting to get more where the public version is actually very blockchain positive. So I think that's a bonus for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And changing gears, another big, I wouldn't say win, but a use case for blockchain, has been where they're now tracking the live coronavirus using the blockchain.
So the story around this is there's a blockchain app developer that has built a dashboard using their tool called Hashlog that lets us visualize a lot of the data. So they're pulling data from the U.S. Center for Disease Control as well as the World Health Organization, and then they've made a pretty dashboard of all the things in terms of where all of the infections are at, total number of deaths, total number of recovered individuals, and different data like that. I kind of get where they want to go with this, where this dashboard is pulling data from the Hedera Hashgraph backend. I don't think in this particular case this is actually solving the discussion around censorship, transparency, trustworthiness in terms of the data, simply because they're pulling this data from the CDC and the World Health Organization. So where is that data coming from? If people aren't reporting that data correctly, or if it's not being completely, if we can't have trust in where that data is coming from because a specific country isn't saying the right numbers or doesn't know the right numbers, then then simply pushing that data now onto a blockchain doesn't necessarily automatically bring some level of trust to that. But I do like the idea that as we can move forward and this data can, as close to the source as possible, be pushed to a blockchain, then the immutability becomes a very interesting thing where we can now have much more trust in whether or not we really know what's going on in situations like this. I think there's a couple things that are interesting that are going on with the blockchain that specifically around coronavirus that's pretty cool. One of them is Hyperchain launched a platform to be able to track medical supply donations. So you can use this and be able to figure out whenever you've provided money, where exactly your donations are going, what kind of what that is purchased and where it's being deployed and those kind of things. And so because that information is being created and pushed directly to the blockchain, then we can have more trust and transparency and knowing that that's true. So I think in those kind of supply chain type in situations, that sounds really fantastic. I think this could be really cool once we have data that is potentially that we can trust a little bit more, but there's nothing saying that the sources of data are specifically 100% trustworthy. So magically adding blockchain doesn't make that so.
Yeah, I think that's a point that's often overlooked, where it's a trustless system, yet you still need the data being put in to be accurate and correct. Now, switching gears to Australia, where Australia has now unveiled their national blockchain roadmap. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the Department of Industry, Science, and Energy and Resources just published their the national blockchain roadmap for Australia. It mentions 3 specific use cases they'd like to work on. Agricultural supply chains, specifically around the wine sector. There's a lot of counterfeiting that goes on in wine, so they want to be managing that as much as possible, but also just the ability to potentially optimize everything around inventory and the actual agricultural side of this. That I think there's some interesting cases there for them to be looking at. They want to be looking at trusted credentials in the university sector. One of the quotes from the report says that up to 25% of people are adding false information to their resumes. So this is one of the use cases we're kind of seeing everywhere, that being able to have a trustable source, an immediate potentially source to verify any kind of credentials around training is very interesting. And then the third one being transferable customer checks. So basically kind of KYC sharing between financial organizations. So if you've gone and gotten a bank account, you've gone through the whole process with them. And now if you want to get a credit card or another bank account, they potentially could just share the KYC that you've already done without having to completely redo all of that and create a lot more efficiency in the space. That's the 3 spaces they want to work on in the beginning. And then this roadmap has 12 specific things that they kind of highlighted they want to work on. Basically, it's around building working groups, mixing public and private, making sure that they are taking examples from other countries about how blockchain's bringing efficiency to government services or how this is being deployed. All kinds of things about making sure that blockchain is a piece of kind of the larger digital technology framework and policy that's being developed on a government level. All kinds of different things to make sure that Australia is competitive in this space and that Australians are benefiting from the efficiencies or other usefulness that blockchain can bring as quickly as possible to different resources, especially around infrastructure and administration in Australia. I think that's a pretty cool thing to see. We're starting to see more and more of this. Monday, I was at a meeting at the French Economic Ministry where they kind of deployed the next stage of the French national strategy around blockchain as well. I think we're going to see more and more of this. It's going to probably look fairly similar between a lot of these countries, but I think it's a great sign to see so much blockchain engagement, and by nature, some of that's going to lean over into crypto assets as well.
And I think, here, as opposed to the coronavirus, where you might necessarily be able to trust the source of information, here it seems like they picked areas where the blockchain is well suited because of the trustworthy sources of the data going in. Now, in a similar vein, the U.S. government has decided to fund, also education blockchain initiative for credentials. Is there overlap there?
Yeah, this is great. So actually, similar story, the U.S. Department of Education has created the Education Blockchain Initiative to basically give students control over their educational records and to allow for verification and validation of that whenever you claim that you have a specific training or education. So it's for universities, but they also see a really big role in this for everything around corporate training, whenever you go and you get continuing education or other training things. One of the statistics I thought was very interesting is that there are 738,000 unique credentials in the United States alone. So the ability to be pushing as many of those as possible to a blockchain so that we can verify those, but also you as the person that is your data, being able to have control over how that's being shared and who's having access to as you push those things out and pull them back if you want. So related stories, 3 months ago, IBM launched the Learning Credential Network, which is a partnership with the National Student Clearinghouse. And the NSC verifies academic qualifications in the US for around 3,700 schools. And the NSC also has joined up to create another consortium with a bunch of different organizations. All of that, I think, is going to see, this is one of the, when people are asking for, well, what's the blockchain really being used for? We see all these different great examples in food safety and supply chain and all kinds of stuff, and credentialing around academic or corporate training is going to be one of the major ones that we see, I think, this year really become just kind of part of culture, in that it's going to speed that process up significantly and provide a lot more trust and transparency to knowing whether or not people have the training they claim.
Now, switching over from blockchain to crypto, Libra was definitely credited as the one to start the conversation when it comes to digital and CBDCs. But it seems like the Chinese the CBDC, or the potential for it, has really been the one making people open their eyes and really pushing that conversation forward. The latest is that Japanese officials are calling for urgent development of digital yen to counter the Chinese CBDC. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so on both sides of the aisle, in terms of parties, they're both pushing pretty hard to create a digital yen is really as soon as possible. They're saying in the next 2 to 3 years, which I guess they haven't been doing much on it yet. But this is a sign of the U.S. story with we might talk about with the Federal Reserve and others, having their opinion about whether or not to have a digital dollar. It seems like the rest of the world is pretty much figuring out that this is going to scale and you need to be a part of it. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind. It does seem like China has really scared a lot of its neighbors with the fact that they've advanced so much on this. So not a lot of stories specifically around detail, but it's just that there is at the top of the government and on both sides, in terms of both the main parties in Japan are pushing for this to happen. They're also Japanese lawmakers have been pushing for this to be included in the G7's agenda for this year, to have the U.S. put digital currencies as one of the topics that they want to discuss. So yeah, I think this is going to be very interesting as the dollar is questions about its supremacy as we move forward in the world economy. Digitally, currencies are going to be a big piece of what might challenge that. And bouncing back to this story with the Federal Reserve and others talking about, how they feel about doing this, whether or not they feel to do it. I think some of the quotes are interesting that that the chairman of the Federal Reserve said that, Libra really kind of lit a fire under the bank's work. I think that's an interesting observation. It's kind of, I think, part of the wow, you think so kind of department there. But it has been a wake-up call, to use his words. And I think that we're seeing a lot of these CBDCs, the discussion spread quickly simply because there are large
before we dissect what he says, we actually have the clip of him speaking. So let's take a look at that first.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Every major central bank is currently taking a deep look at that we feel like that's our obligation. Technology has now made this possible. Private sector's innovating, they're doing it. So I think it's very much incumbent on us and other central banks to understand the costs and benefits and trade-offs associated with a possible digital currency. Frankly, Libra really lit a fire under that, and it was a bit of a wake-up call that this is coming fast and could come in a way that is that is quite widespread and systemically important fairly quickly if you use one of these big tech networks like Libra did. So we're working hard on it. We fully appreciate the importance of making quick progress.
Yeah. So how seriously do you think they're taking it? Is he just playing lip service, or is this something that they're seriously considering? And where do you think they're leaning?
Well, it's interesting that he says that they're working hard on it. I guess that means that they're working hard on analyzing it, because at the same time, both he and Steve Mnuchin, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, are saying that they're not aggressively pushing for a digital dollar, and that they, in the next 5 years, don't see a need for the Fed to issue a digital currency. So I guess I'm curious as to what aggressively working on means. I'd assume that that's the analysis of whether or not this needs to happen. I think that's kind of probably a moot point. We already have the consortium or corporate ones that are out there like Line that are already running a regional digital currency. Libra Association, which has run in all kinds of regulatory issues, but has pushed tons of other conversations. And then you have all the other governments, especially with China's advancement on this subject. So we're going to definitely see more corporate digital currencies. We're going to see more central bank digital currencies, and we're going to see a continued rise in decentralized digital currencies. And so I think it's a no-brainer that the U.S. will have to be a part of that. What will that look like? I don't know, but there needs to be some kind of digitalization to the way the dollar impacts the world's economy. Otherwise, it potentially is going to get left behind.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope that's not the case. It seems like the CBDC is the future for currencies going forwards. When that will happen for Japan, for China, and for America, we're not sure, but I am sure that you'll be back here to fill us in. Ethan, thank you so much for joining us here today. And for all our viewers back at home, if you want more on tech, blockchain, or cryptocurrencies, make sure to check us out at BLOCKTV.com.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.